There is a kind of order that has no business surviving. A great house may be shut and a family scattered, and the grounds they loved may go back, season upon season, to bramble and thorn and the slow patience of the wild. And yet, somewhere in the heart of all that gentle ruin, one small square of earth may stay turned, and weeded, and kept, as though the hands that tended it had never heard that the world had moved on. On the far edge of a great cold estate one winter, a new man came upon such a place behind a high wall, and he learned, before that winter was out, that the hands still kept it, that they had never stopped, and that in the dead hour they were still out there among the frozen beds by the light of a lantern, keeping a promise that death itself had not been permitted to end. Good evening. Come in out of the cold and let me shut the door on it and draw your chair up nearer the fire, for this is a story that keeps to the deep of winter and is best told with the dark pressed close against the glass. I am the one who tells these tales. I gather the ones that people carry quietly for the whole of their lives, and I sit with each until it settles into something I can hand across to you. Tonight's story came to me from a man who spent a single winter as the groundskeeper of a great emptied estate away in the north, and who, for all the long life he lived afterward, never let one small garden of his own go untended a single day. So settle back into the warmth, and let me tell you about a shut house, a wild garden, and an old man and his wife who would not put down their tools. The man at the heart of it was not young, and not old. He had been a gardener on other people's land the whole of his days, good with his hands and easy with his own silence, and when the winter came that this story keeps, he was out of a place and glad of anything. So when word reached him that a great estate on the moor's edge wanted a single man to keep its grounds through the cold months, no household, no family in residence, only the land to be watched over until the lawyers settled what was to become of it, he took the post before he had rightly asked himself why such a place should stand empty at all. He would come to understand out there that there is a solitude that is only the absence of the living, and then there is a solitude that is very full indeed, and only waiting for the dark to show you so. The estate was a vast one, and had been a grand one, and was neither any longer. The great house stood shuttered and sheeted at the head of a long, weed-cracked drive, its chimneys cold and its 100 windows blind, its family, an old and dwindling line, gone down at last to the final few, dead or scattered to cities far off, so that the whole place had passed into the gray keeping of lawyers and waited, year by year, for a decision that never came. The gardens that had once been the pride of the county had gone back to the wild, the yew walks grown shaggy, the great lawns gone to rough meadow, the glass houses standing with their panes fallen in. It was a beautiful desolation, and it did not trouble him. There was one exception, and he learned of it on his first evening from the steward, an elderly, careful man who did not stay past dusk if he could help it. Before he took up his hat to go, the steward stopped the new man by the door and told him the one thing that was written in no agreement and set down in no book. Put into my own words, it was this: let the rest of the grounds go as they please. No one living will ever walk them again. But away at the far end of the east grounds, beyond the wild yews, there is an old walled garden, a kitchen garden of the old sort, high brick on every side and a single door in the wall, and that one, whatever else you let go, you are to keep. Turn its soil when the frost allows. Tend the little shrine at its heart and keep the well beside it clear. And then the steward had looked at him a moment longer in the failing light, and added the rest of it lower, as a man says a thing he would rather not, that if ever the new man should find himself out at the far end in the dead hour, and should see a light moving in the walled garden, and an old man and his wife at work there among the beds by lantern light, he was to do 3 things and no more. He was not to speak to them. He was not to stop them, nor go in among them, nor lend a hand at their work. And above all, he was to leave the garden and the shrine and the thing they kept exactly as he found it, for they had kept a promise there longer than any living memory, and it was not his to break. He took the steward's words for what they plainly sounded like. the sort of tale that grows over an old empty place the way ivy grows over its walls, handed from one caretaker to the next because a lonely post wants peopling somehow, even with a fear. He thanked the man, and watched the trap go rattling away down the long drive, and then he was alone with the shut house, and the great cold quiet of the estate settling round him like water closing over a stone. That first night he slept well enough, and in the morning he walked the near grounds in the thin winter light and thought it as lovely and harmless a ruin as a man could wish to be left alone in. That much was still true. It would not stay true for long. He did not go out to the walled garden at once, and that tells you the kind of man he was. He was not one to go hunting after a fear handed to him. He was more inclined to let a place tell him its business in its own time. But a rule given is a thing that pulls at a man, and a garden he had been charged to tend was a duty as much as a mystery. And on the fourth day, with a clear cold noon over the estate and a spade on his shoulder, he went down the long east grounds to see the thing he had been set to keep. The way to it was half lost. The old path had gone under grass and bramble, and the yews had closed over it into a dark green tunnel that he had to push his way through, so that when he came out into the open and saw the wall, it was with the particular surprise of a thing found where the land had done its best to hide it. It was a high garden wall of old rose-red brick, mellowed and lichened with its centuries, with a single stout door of weathered oak set into the near side. And the strangeness of it reached him before he had so much as touched the door, because the wall, unlike every other built thing on that estate, was sound. The coping was whole, the brick pointed and firm. Where all else was falling, this one high square stood as trim as though the mason had gone home from it the week before. He lifted the latch and pushed the heavy door and went in, and what he found inside stopped him on the threshold with the breath gone still in his chest. For the wild ended at that wall as though a line had been drawn. Inside was a garden, a true, worked, living garden, kept to a pitch of order he had not seen on the whole ruined estate and would scarcely have believed of a place with any family left to pay for it, let alone none. The long beds were dug and turned and dark, edged straight as a rule, dressed against the frost. The espaliered fruit trees were pruned hard and neat along the warm south wall, the gravel walks raked. And down at the heart of it, where the four walks met, there stood a low-weathered shrine, an old worn niche of a thing, hardly more than a carved stone hood over a small kept space, with a little stone well beside it, and the ground all about it was the most tended of all, swept and weeded to the last blade, with a small clay pot of something green and living set before it, fresh, as though it had been placed there that very morning by a hand that meant to come back and place another tomorrow. He walked the garden slowly, and the more he saw of it the less sense it made. This was not the leavings of some care taken years ago and long abandoned. This was daily work, a garden tended, patiently and skillfully, and without a day's lapse, by someone who knew it as a man knows the back of his own hand, and the estate had not employed a gardener in longer than anyone in the town could rightly say. He told himself the sensible things, an old villager keeping it for love, the steward paying someone quietly, and none of it quite fitted, because there was no track worn to that far door but the one he had just broken himself, and the fresh green in the pot before the shrine had been set there by a hand that had left no footprint at all on the raked and frosted gravel. He did the work he had come to do, because the doing of it steadied him, and then went back up through the yews as the light failed, and told himself he would think no more of it. But that night, very late, some restlessness he could not name took him to the cottage window that looked away east over the black grounds. And down there, across the whole dark width of the sleeping estate, where he knew there stood only a walled garden with no soul in it for a mile, a small warm light was moving. It went slowly and low and steadily, back and forth and along, in the patient, unhurried way of a lantern carried by someone at work among beds in the dark. It never left the bounds of the walls, and near 2 in the morning, at the low still turn of the night, it dimmed and sank and went out, the way a lantern goes out that has been set down at last by someone kneeling to their work. He did not sleep much after that, and I don't suppose any of us would have. He lay in the dark of the cottage and told himself all the things the daylight would surely explain: a poacher, a lost soul from the village, a trick of his own tired eyes on the black glass, and by morning he had half persuaded himself, in the way a man does who wants very much to be persuaded. But the walled garden had a hold on him now that would not let go, and it was not, he told me, a hold of fear so much as of a kind of wondering tenderness, for there is nothing quite so gentle to look upon as a thing kept faithfully, and nothing that pulls so hard at a decent man's heart as the wish to know who keeps it, and why. So he went back day after day, and each night the light came back to the walls. At last, on a still and bitter night deep in that winter, he wrapped himself against the cold and went down through the black yews to the far wall in the dead hour, to see for himself who worked the garden in the dark. The door in the wall stood a little ajar, a soft glow leaking out at its edge, and he came up to it quietly over the frozen grass and looked in through the gap. And there, in the heart of the walled garden, in the pool of a single warm lantern set down upon the gravel, were an old man and his wife, at their work among the winter beds. They were an old country couple of the plain and weathered kind he had known the whole of his life, dressed in the fashion of a good many years past, the man in a rough coat and an old soft hat, the woman in a long dark dress and shawl, a wide bonnet pushed back from her gray head. The old man was down on one knee at the edge of a bed with a trowel in his hand, firming something into the cold soil with the slow sure care of a lifetime's practice, and the old woman knelt at the little shrine at the crossing of the walks, drawing a cloth over the worn stone, setting all to rights with the tenderness of a mother at a child's bed. They did not speak, the wordless understanding of two people who have worked side by side so long they have no more need of speech than the two hands of one body. And over the whole of it lay a peace so deep that the man at the door forgot, for a while, to be afraid. There was nothing dreadful in that garden. There was only a lantern in the cold, and two old people at their patient work, and the great tender quiet of a labor that had gone on so long it had worn itself smooth as a stone in a stream. He watched them a long time, and what rose in him, he told me, was not the terror you would expect but something worse to bear, because it was so near to love. It was pity and longing, and the ache a lonely man feels at the window of a lit and peopled room. For here were two souls who had one another and a work they loved, out in all that dark and empty ruin, and here was he alone watching them from the cold on the wrong side of a door. And a great part of him, the part that had made him a gardener in the first place, that cannot pass a struggling row without stooping to it, wanted nothing so much as to go in, and kneel down in the lantern light beside them and take up a trowel and help. His hand was on the door and the cold latch was rising under his thumb before the steward's face came back to him in the dark. Do not speak to them. Do not go in among them. Do not lend a hand at their work. He stopped himself, with his heart going hard and slow, and stepped back into the deeper dark of the wall. And as he did, the old woman at the shrine lifted her head not sharply, not in alarm, but slowly, and turned her face toward the door where he stood, as a person turns who has felt a draught or sensed, without quite hearing it, that someone kind is near. He could not see her face clearly, and he was glad of it, glad because what he could see was not fearsome in the least, but only old and patient and unbearably gentle, and he knew that if she had looked full at him he could not have kept himself from answering it. He drew back into the yews and went up to the cottage with his blood loud in his ears, and behind him the lantern went on, low and steady, until the turn of the night. In the morning he made himself go down again in the clean cold daylight. The garden was as trim and empty as ever, but at the little shrine, where the old woman had knelt in the night, the green pot had been freshened and the stones swept, and there was no footprint on the frost, and no wax fallen from any lantern, and no sign in all that ordered ground that a living soul had been there since the world began. And then he did the only thing left to a man in his position that was any use at all. He went up to the great shut house, let himself into the cold estate office where the lawyer's papers were kept, and he began to read. The estate had kept its books in a long, unbroken run of ledgers and wage lists, and he sat in the cold office over them for the better part of 2 days, turning the stiff fox pages by lamplight. And near the middle of that long run of years, in the wage lists of a season some 50 winters gone, he found the first of it, a line for a gardener and his wife, taken onto the estate together, kept on the books year upon year in the same 2 names, right down to a winter where the 2 names stopped in a single season together, and were ruled off with one quiet line and never entered again. And tucked among the ledgers, kept apart in a drawer as a thing valued, he found the rest of it, a garden diary, an old worn book in a plain country hand, the daily record of the walled garden kept faithfully across the whole of those 50 years by the very hand that had kept the garden itself. He read it through, and the story it told him pieced out from the diary's own patient entries, and from what the steward, pressed at last, would tell him, put into my own words and softened where it wants to be, was this. Long ago, in the days when the great house was full, and the family still walked its own gardens, the old couple had come to that country with nothing at all. They had been wanderers, turned off from somewhere and turned away everywhere, come to the estate gate one hard winter with no more claim on the place than any beggar has on any door. And they would have been sent on their way, as such folk always were, but for a child. For the family had a daughter then, a little girl, the youngest and last of that old line, and she had been at the gate when the ragged couple came to it. And she had taken it into her small, stubborn heart that they should not be turned away into the cold, and she had begged her father for them until the thing was done. And so the old couple were taken in, and given the cottage and an honest wage and a place in the world when they had none, all through the pity of one small girl who could not bear to see 2 strangers sent to die in the snow. They never forgot it. A kindness like that, done to those who have nothing, is not a thing the grateful ever set down. The garden was the child's own. The walled garden had been given over to her, in the way such families would give a child a patch to call her kingdom, and it was there she played out the whole of her childhood and loved best in all the estate. And the little stone shrine at its heart was her own small holy place, a worn niche where she kept her treasures and said her child's prayers. And the old couple, in their gratitude, made that garden their life's whole care. They kept it for her as she grew and made it the finest thing on the estate. They loved her as their own. They had no children, and she had saved their lives at a gate one winter, and so they poured the whole of their long devotion into the one thing that was hers. And then the young woman was lost. She went away from the estate, as the young of such families did away to a city or across the sea. The diary is not clear, and I think the old man could hardly bear to write it plainly. And there, far from home, in a bad winter of some spreading sickness, she took ill and died, a great deal too young. She was buried where she fell, among strangers, under no stone that anyone who loved her ever saw. And the family meant, as families always mean, to bring her home to lie in the garden she had loved. But the money was failing, the line was dwindling, the years went by, and it was never done. She lay far off in a stranger's ground, unmarked and unvisited, and her own small garden and her own small shrine stood waiting for her at the heart of the walled square, and she never came. The old couple would not have it. The last entries in the diary, in a hand grown shaky and old but never once faltering, set it down plain, that they would keep her garden and keep her shrine, and hold it all ready and perfect against the day she was brought home to it at last, for as long as ever they lived. And they kept that word to the very end, the 2 names ruled off together in the wage book, an old man and his wife gone within a season of each other, worn out in the service of a promise. But the promise was not kept for all their keeping of it. The one thing they had vowed, to have their girl home and laid to rest in her own ground beneath her own shrine, was never in their power while they lived, for they were only servants, with no say over where the dead of the family should lie. They tended an empty shrine for 50 years, waiting for a homecoming that no one ever arranged, and death, when it came, did not release them from it. A promise like that, made by the grateful to the one who saved them, and left undone through no fault of their own, is a debt that does not let its debtors rest. And so they had gone on keeping the garden, night after night, waiting still, for their girl to be brought home so that they might lay her down at last and be done. He closed the book. Outside the office window the early dark had come down over the ruined grounds, and away at the far end of the east, he knew the lantern had come again to the walled garden, and that the two of them were at their patient work, keeping ready a place for someone who had been 50 years in coming. And he understood now what it was they kept and what they waited for and what it would take to let them rest. That was the worst of it and the truest. He understood them perfectly. The worst night of that winter came a little before its end, and he knew it for a bad one from the moment the dark shut down, for it came with a still, hard, breathless frost, the kind of night when the whole world seems to hold its breath and the stars burn close and cold. He had meant to keep to his cottage and his fire and let the far garden keep its own long watch without him. He did not. Something in the knowing of it now, in the whole sad weight of what he had read, drew him down through the black frozen yews to the wall in the dead hour, and he came to the door, and it stood ajar with its soft glow leaking out, and he looked in. They were there, as he had known they would be, the old man and his wife in the pool of the lantern. But this night was different, and he felt it the instant he looked in, for this night they were not merely tending. The old woman knelt at the shrine with her worn hands folded and her gray head bowed, and the old man stood beside her with his hat off against his chest, and the two of them were still, and waiting, turned toward the empty kept place at the heart of the garden with a look of such patient, aching, unbearable hope that it went into him like the cold itself. They were waiting for their girl. They had kept the place ready one more night, as they had kept it for 50 years of nights, and they waited with their whole faithful hearts for her to be brought home to it at last. And there was no one to bring her, and there never had been. And that was when the pull came on him in its full strength. For as he stood there at the door, aching with the whole sorrow of it, the thought rose up in him quiet and warm and terribly reasonable, that he could go in, that he could lift the latch and cross the frosted gravel into the lantern light, and kneel down there beside the two faithful old souls, and take up a trowel, and stay, and never be alone and cold and shut out on the wrong side of a door again. That here was a work worth the giving of a life to, and here were two who would take him in, as the family had once taken them in, and he would have a place, and a purpose, and company in the long dark. He had only to go in and kneel and take up the trowel and be one of them, and the loneliness of his whole hard life would be over. His hand was on the latch. He does not think he ever told it to be. He said the pull of that warm-lit place after the cold of his whole life was so strong and so reasonable and so nearly kind that some part of him leaned toward it the way a frozen man leans toward a fire, past all thought of what the fire will cost him. The latch was rising under his thumb. In the lantern light the two old people knelt and waited, patient past all bearing. And he came within the space of a breath, within the small last weight of a thumb on a cold iron latch, of lifting it and going in and kneeling down among them and never coming out of that garden again. What stopped him in the end was not the steward's rule, and it was not fear. It was the diary, and the one thing in it he had not been able to put down, that the old couple were kept in that garden not by love of the work, nor even by love of their girl, but by a promise left undone, and that the doing of it was the only thing that could set them free. He understood, with his thumb on the rising latch, what the two of them could not. That to go in now, and kneel and take up the trowel beside them, would not end their waiting nor his own. It would only add himself to it, three of them now instead of two, kneeling in the cold at a ready and empty shrine, waiting for a homecoming that no waiting could ever bring about. For the one thing the old couple needed was not another pair of faithful hands to tend the beds. It was for someone to bring their girl home. And that, he saw, was a thing that he could do, not by kneeling and not by staying, but by going back into the world of the living, and doing with his living hands the one plain, hard, human thing that 50 years of faithful ghosts had never been able to do for want of the standing to do it. So he took his hand from the latch and turned his back on the two old souls at their endless work, which was the hardest thing he ever did. And he went up through the black yews to the cottage, and by morning he knew what he must do. It took him the rest of that winter, and a good part of his own small savings, and he never once grudged it. From the estate books in the old diary, he had the name of the far city where she had died, and he wrote letters, and waited on answers and wrote again, patient and stubborn as an old gardener at a hard row, until at the last, in a neglected corner of a great city cemetery under no stone at all, he found where their girl had lain unvisited for 50 years. And then he did the thing that all the love of two faithful ghosts had never had the power to do. With the leave of the last scattered few of the family, and at the cost of very nearly all he had her brought home, lifted at last from her stranger's ground, carried the long way north to the estate that had been hers, and laid to rest where she had always belonged, in the heart of the walled garden, beneath her own small shrine, in the one square of loving earth that had waited 50 years for her coming. And over her he set a plain good stone, and cut into it her name and her years, and beneath them the only words he could think of that were true, that here at last lay the daughter of that house, brought home, long waited for and dearly kept. And the garden let them go. The night after the girl was laid in her own ground beneath her own shrine, he went down in the dead hour to the wall and looked in through the door, and the lantern light was there in the garden still, but it was not at its work. The old man and his wife stood together in the pool of the lantern at the foot of the new stone, the old man with his hat in his hand and the old woman's arm through his, looking down at the homecoming they had kept ready for 50 faithful years, come at last. And he told me there was nothing dreadful in it, and nothing cold, that it was gentler than that, and gladder and better than he had words for. For as he watched, the two old souls seemed to loose their long hold on the place, the way a hand at the end of a good day's work loosens at last from the tool it has gripped since dawn, and the lantern light did not gutter or die so much as it simply eased and let go, and where the two of them had stood, there was only the quiet garden, and the new stone, and the frost coming down soft and ordinary over a square of earth that had, at last, nothing left in it that waited. He never saw the light again. He tended the walled garden to the end of his post, and when the spring was over he went away from that estate and did not come back. But he kept a garden of his own every year of the long life he lived after, and never let it go a day untended, and when he was very old he told me why. He said that of all he had learned there, the one thing he could never set down was the sight of the two of them at the last, standing over the stone with the waiting finally gone out of them. Two people given a home when they had nothing, who had spent 50 years, and then their deaths, and then 50 years more, trying to pay it back, and were not allowed to rest until the debt of one great kindness was discharged in full, because the dead are not always out there to frighten us. Sometimes they are only two grateful old people at their patient work in the cold, keeping a promise the living let fall, and waiting with a faithfulness that ought to shame us all for one kind soul to come and help them keep it. That's where I'll leave them and leave you with the garden quiet, the shrine tended, and a girl brought home at last to the one square of earth that never stopped waiting for her. If you'd sit up in the small hours for a story as tender as this one, then do me a kindness before you go. Like it, share it, and subscribe, so the next tale finds its way to you when the dark comes down. And if the comments are open, tell me, was there ever a promise, or a debt of kindness, or a thing left undone by someone you loved, that you would go a long cold way to see kept at last? Sleep well if you can. Keep a light burning in the window if you'd rather, for anyone still out in the dark and faithfully at their work. And if you should ever come, in some wild and forgotten place, upon one small square of earth kept perfect against all reason, a garden, or a grave, or a shrine, tended by someone who ought long ago to have laid their tools down, then be gentle, and heed the old rules as they are given to you. but do not be too quick to call it a haunting. Some of the waiting dead are only the faithful, kept from their rest by a promise they could not finish. And the kindest thing a living soul can do when the walled garden keeps its keepers is not to kneel and stay forever, but to find the one undone thing and do it for them, and let them lay their tools down and go home. Good night.